The world's biggest myth, the pyramids. Still to this day, we don't know how they were actually built and how Egyptians had managed to build them. In this video, our task is to solve that myth and to decode which theory may be the correct one. The ramp theory. The pyramids at Giza were built somewhere between 2550 and 2490 BC. That's 4,500 years ago, and life was pretty different then. During ancient Egyptian times, the era in which they were building the pyramids in particular, there were technologies and techniques that were widely used, and others that, although available, were less popular. It seems that during this pyramid building era, the Egyptians were less inclined to use work animals or wheeled vehicles to perform most of these building tasks. Despite this, they managed to move 2.3 million of these colossal stone blocks, with each one weighing an average of 2.5 tons, and although this seems basically impossible, the pyramids are there, so they did it somehow. There are actually pyramid constructions all across the region. Some were built in the 100 years before the Giza pyramids, and these seem to have been used to figure out the technique. They did not survive the way the others have, but this is largely because they were experimental. These practice pyramids taught the ancient Egyptians a lot about the importance of the foundations on which they built these incredibly heavy structures, as well as offering useful information about thermal expansion and the effect that this can have on the stone. So, the theory that some scientists have proposed would suggest that most of the force behind the building was human labor. It's been discovered that people who built the pyramids lived in a temporary city that was close to the pyramid site. Archaeologists have uncovered a huge amount of evidence of the community that lived there during that time. There are masses of animal bones, the remains of a bakery, and proof of an organized society that covered 17 acres of space. It's believed that the people that lived in this so-called city came from all across Egypt to build these pyramids. Engineers have suggested the most likely way the huge blocks of stone were moved was by the usage of large ramps that were made slick by water or clay in order to help the stone slide. They then used a system of levers, rollers, ropes, and sledges to hoist the blocks into place. There's also plenty of evidence that ramps were used generally in construction of other pyramids. Some even have the remains of the ramp still visible. But what is uncertain is exactly what type of ramp structure was used at Giza. There was no one-size-fits-all type of ramp for these purposes. They varied depending on the requirements at the time, and therefore the whole ramp technique had an ad hoc quality. If a ramp that fitted in a circular fashion was best for the job, then that's what they used. If, however, a long straight ramp was likely to be more effective in that instance, well, then that's how they constructed it. The nearby quarries from which the stone for the pyramids was removed were then filled in with the remnants of the ramps and other construction materials. There's plenty of physical evidence people power and ramps were at the heart of the pyramid's construction. Alien construction. There is trouble with the ramp theory, though. Plenty of people have many questions about the practical application of this kind of technique. Some people have argued that the system would have required the ramps to be about a mile long. This, they say, is basically impossible. In fact, there are such skeptics that they say the ancient Egyptians simply could not have achieved the building of the pyramids with the technology that was available to them at the time. The only possible explanation for some people, including the ubiquitous Elon Musk apparently, is that aliens built the pyramids. The general idea that proponents of the alien theory have is that the pyramids were constructed using a vague mishmash of some techniques that they call gravity manipulation, anti-gravity, sacred geometry, plasmoid implosion technology, and resonance and acoustics. What these things are or how they may work has been left suitably mysterious, but alien theorists insist there is no way that humans could have built these structures without alien technology. So how does the theory measure up? Well, it's generally an ignorant answer to the mysteries of the past, and unfortunately also one in which the history of African, Asian, and Latin American peoples' histories are undermined. Why is it less likely that the ancient Egyptians constructed their pyramids than it is that the ancient Greeks had the technologies that are generally accepted as their own? There is no real answer to the way in which the aliens were supposed to have constructed the pyramids. Some conspiracy theorists would argue that the aliens had built them, while others say they taught the humans how to build them. Either way, this is a fairly weak argument with no actual evidence to back it up. Unfortunately, even though it may seem like a fun concept, the notion that civilization civilizations outside of the Western world had advanced technology is something that is quite hard for some people to believe, mostly because of prejudice. Aliens as an idea have only really existed in the mainstream since H.G. Wells published The War of the Worlds in 1897. However, the pyramids in Egypt have stood for more than 4,000 years. We may not have the fine details of how the pyramids were constructed, but that doesn't mean that we need to look for answers in outer space. Water flotation. The next theory that we're going to examine involves the use of water. Water is the source of life, and in the Nile Delta, it's the very factor that affects everything that happens there. The River Nile is the longest river in Africa and is Egypt's main water source. This river is the reason that the ancient Egyptian civilization existed in the first place. So, it's a powerful and compelling idea that it was the force of the river, or water in general, which allowed the pyramids to be constructed. This was a major transportation route in the region, and when the pyramids were constructed, the Nile would have actually reached the edge of the site for about 6 to 8 weeks out of the year during the flooding season. So, it does seem quite feasible that the ancient builders may have used the rise and fall of the river to support the construction and move the stones into position. As far as a water flotation technique for building the pyramids goes, there is an unsupported theory which would suggest that a long causeway was created from a nearby water source. This, they say, was then used as a transportation system upon which the huge blocks of stone would be moved by being floated on rafts made out of wood, or, some have suggested, inflated animal skins may have been used. They were then pulled through a series of pipelines that were allegedly able to move the massive stones upwards without the need for extremely heavy lifting. Some have suggested that there was then an elaborate system of gates, which controlled the movement of the stones from the moat to the top in order to allow the block to be positioned. There is a fairly major flaw in this theory, though. How do you get water to flow upward? And in addition, there is no physical evidence anywhere that the technique was used. So that puts a bit of a dampener on the water theory. Atlantis Connection. The next theory is one that goes alongside the alien construction theory. In the world of historical facts, there are also some extremely dubious ideas that have no real basis in evidence. These are known as pseudo-archaeological theories, meaning that these ideas have been put together despite the many types of evidence that disproves them. This theory is kind of speculative to say the least. The legend of Atlantis is one of the greatest myths ever told. Atlantis was a fictional place that Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, had created around 360 BCE. In this place, he said the founders were half human and half god. The society they built was a highly advanced utopian civilization that was spread across islands that were filled with gold and silver and were inhabited by incredibly rare creatures. There was a huge earthquake that wiped out Atlantis and it disappeared into the sea. This is when, according to the proponents of this theory, the survivors of the Atlantean civilization traveled around the world, bringing their advanced ideas to other places, mainly in the form of building pyramid-like structures. The pyramids of Latin America have also been attributed to the lost city of Atlantis, but this is a theory that was begun by a wannabe scientist named Ignatius L. Donnelly. He was actually an American congressman. However, in 1882, he wrote a pseudo-scientific book all about his own theories of Atlantis, in which he proposed that Atlantis was actually real and was the cradle of civilization. This is where the idea of the fictional people's pyramid building passion first be invented. And so, if the Atlanteans had not been fictitious, it might be possible to imagine that they had the technology and wherewithal to construct elaborate and complex pyramids. But if they had the technology and the knowledge at the same time in history, then why wouldn't the ancient Egyptians also have those same capabilities and have been well equipped to fashion their own monuments? That's where the theory disappears into the sea. The Kite Theory. This next theory may sound kind of cuckoo, but according to the scientists who proposed it, they've actually tested the theory and say that it's possible. Back in 2001, a software consultant from California named Maureen Clemens first came up with the idea that the ancient Egyptians could have used kites to build the pyramids. She studied the monuments of ancient Egypt and thought that they held clues to this idea. She said that there was one hieroglyph in particular showing a row of people who appeared to be holding on to ropes that seemed to be attached to a bird in the sky. She suggested that that bird was actually a kite and that kites could be the secret to all of the moving of those massive blocks of stone. It sounds bananas, but she didn't stop at theorizing. She began by using several shop-bought kites and a group of friends to attend attempt to lift a heavy log and a concrete obelisk. And it actually worked. Eventually, a group of aeronautics students at Caltech got involved, and they designed a system of ropes and pulleys that could increase the weight that a kite could pull by up to 4 times. This resulted in one kite being able to lift a block that was 3.5 tons. The wind needed to be blowing at 15 miles per hour, but it was possible. They had lifted huge weights and moved them from one place to another. It would be swift and efficient. But did the ancient Egyptians do it like this? Unfortunately for the aeronautics enthusiast, there is little to support the theory amongst bona fide Egyptologists. They say that there's no evidence whatsoever that kites existed in ancient Egypt, nor for the sorts of pulleys that they used in the experiment. They were not convinced that kites had built the pyramids. Advanced ancient technology. The argument against much of the more practical ideas of pyramid construction is that people now just don't think it was possible. There must be another answer. It couldn't possibly have been done with only manual labor and basic tools. Some have argued that there must have been some extremely advanced ancient technology in use. And what kind of technology is left unexplained? Because naturally, there is no actual evidence. A pharaoh with enormous amounts of power could summon workers, designers, and artisans to build almost anything that they could imagine at the time. Pyramids had been less successfully created before the ones were built at Giza, so the technology had advanced during the years preceding their construction. Lessons had been learned about the best angles and the best materials and the more practical building techniques. They didn't only appear on the landscape overnight. The pyramids were the result of research and development, like all things technologically. What we think of as advanced technologies today, things like smartphones and electric cars and the internet, are relative to our modern world and the advancements that people have made over the course of thousands of years of learning and developing. The same would be true in the ancient world, but the technology that they had back then doesn't look advanced to our contemporary eyes. The truth is that the ancient Egyptians used great skill and collected knowledge, as well as a labor force that was neither enslaved nor ignorant to build these very precise monuments. And that surely is the definition of advanced ancient technology. Let me know in the comments which of these theories you think is correct, and write your ideas about the pyramid's construction. This was Civilize. Subscribe, because the next video is the even bigger myth that we must solve together.